All right, streamers, if you'd let me know if the stream is working, you can hear me and everything, that'd be nice. And then we'll get started. Anyone out there streaming? Maybe? Well, I guess keep an eye on the chat, and if anyone says anything about it not working, cool. All right, how's everyone feeling about React, huh? Cool, yeah, it's fun. Some people like it, some people might not. It's a difficult topic for sure, but it's a lot of fun. So hopefully Saturday and Tuesday were good to you, and I can kind of fill in best I can here today for any of the questions you may have. I'm going to be here Saturday and Tuesday too, so you guys are stuck with me for a while. So hopefully that's a good thing. Some people would say no. Trent's probably dreading it. Trent was another one that was in my cohort when I was a TA/instructor the first time around when they did this. I think it was actually the second cohort. That's not that important. Anyway, we'll go ahead and do a little review of React. Again, if anyone has any questions about anything, or you just want to chit-chat a bit about React, then great, we can. Before we jump in, we have quite a bit to go over. We're going to go over like full MERN stack pretty much today. I'm going to do some stuff with Express and React. I don't know how much you did in the last lesson in that regard. I'm going to do talking with Mongo, all kinds of fun things. And then we're going to deploy to Heroku if we have enough time. And that's cool because that will teach you how to literally deploy your own website to the web. You can do it at home for free and have all your friends and family go visit it. So that's pretty cool. So we'll get into it. What event listener do we use to capture changes on an input element? Is on change. Yes. I love the enthusiasm. It's great. All right. So here's what's going on in this React form class. Okay. So we have our state set. Let me see if I can blow it up. Cool. We have our state set, right? Our username just defaults to coolguy1337. We have a handle input change function right here. Which is going to function as our, right? So in jQuery, that'd be like our on change or whatever. And then we have our render function, which render out to the DOM or to the virtual DOM in React. So the first thing we do is render out this.state.username, which is hello cool guy 1337. And just change this. Wow, it changes so quick. Amazing that it's reactive, right? Beyond change is set. So everyone kind of remember what's look in the property value as a dynamic way to set the name of a property on an object. Basically, just like we were told, if you have like a first name and last name and you're setting a bunch of stuff with a single handle input change, you don't have to take the name out of the event target and say like, hey, first name equals first name, last name equals last name, or whatever. You can just quickly do it dynamically. And this is a cool little shorthand syntax that you're going to want to remember. Change handler. Any questions? What's up?
I don't know if it's off topic, but instead of doing it that way, could you explicitly define your thing that you want to change the state of in your state of top instead of it kind of?
Yes. So the question was, instead of doing this dynamic allocation, could we just do it ourselves? Yeah, totally. Is that the question?
Yeah, because I was like when you're doing this, you don't really have a way, I guess, in your code to see what, when you dynamically do that, you don't necessarily see all of the different properties that you're changing the state of. So is there like a way that you can query that?
Okay, is there a way to query the state that's changing in your React element if you're changing it dynamically? Probably. There's probably a way to hook into the state. The easiest way is to just do a console log of your state on render. You'll see the state that's changed every time it renders. And that's a good tip if you do that, it's not going to show here, obviously. But if you're in your render and you're like, hey, I want to see what causes something to re-render, you could do this .state right here, and it would tell you everything that's changing every time it renders. And remember, when we call set state, it forces a re-render if those values actually change. In this case, they do. So you could explicitly set the username like, if you wanted to. But the cool thing about this dynamic one is this handle input change is reusable over infinite number of inputs, right? As long as the name field on the input is set to the same name as the property and state. So if I change this to username 2, this is going to break. It actually doesn't do anything anymore because I just totally messed up because the username can't be changed anymore. I'm changing something in state called username 2, which you guys can't see because it's not rendering on the page, and it's just all hokey and messed up at that point, right? So there are some tips. You can log out the state if you really want to know what's going on in your component. If you don't like dynamic property changes, you don't have to use them, but they are nice because it makes things really reusable, right? Any more questions on this? Cool. How can we conditionally render elements in React? Anyone? Someone's got to know. Exactly. We can write conditional logic directly inside of JSX curly braces using a ternary expression or a short circuit operator. What's a ternary? Who knows what a ternary is? Fancy word. The question mark colon, yeah. And what does that operate as effectively? An if else. Yeah, that's exactly what it is. So remember, you'll have the ternary. It'll have a Boolean check somewhere. In this case, it's this state count modulo 2 equals 0. What does that do? What is the modulo 2? Who remembers? It's a remainder. Yeah, the output of that divisible by 2, or it's an even number. We're going to go ahead and say, whoa, that's an even number. Weird emoji screen face. Or if it's not, that's an odd number, and I'm sad for some reason. I don't know. Apparently makes a difference. Whoa, oh, whoa, So the ternaries are nice because they're shorthand syntax for your if-else if you need to use them. You can do them inline. React allows you to put things in curly braces, which is kind of confusing because we use them for a whole bunch of things in JavaScript, and React adds a whole nother use, and just to make things even harder for you to learn. But you can do it, and this is how. Any questions on this before I move on? Cool. We can also write conditional logic inside of a function, which we run inside of JSX curly braces. So again, those curly braces, they're like a literal translation. So before the React framework takes your fake HTML and actually renders it to real HTML, anything in curly braces, it will evaluate. So if it's a function, it'll invoke the function. If it's a string literal, it'll be like, great, it's a string. If it's a this.state.count, it'll be like, cool, we'll get it whatever's in that variable, and it'll just use it. The evaluation just takes whatever the general term is expression, takes whatever expression is there, and it does whatever it needs to do to get the value out. You can put a bad expression there, and bad things will happen if you really wanted. But just know that the curly braces are very powerful because they do things for you. On that note, though, so you can see here we have the render odd or even, which is effectively the same as the ternary, right? It's the if modulo of 2 on the count is 0, so it's an even number. We're going to do our weird screamy face or shocked face if it's odd, and we're going to do the, like, I'm too cool for this face. So this is just like our ternary in a more verbose way, which isn't wrong. Yeah?
What does extend?
Oh, right here, class counter extends. That's a good question. So in the React components, we always have this extends keyword when we're making a class, right? We've seen that a few times, and it's kind of an interesting keyword. Basically, what it says is when you create a class, you can take another class and extend it. Literally, that's what it's saying. It's saying you're extending that class. And by extending, it means if the React component has some functions on its prototype or has some functions that it defines, you now get access to them. So our counter class here has access to all of the cool things that the React.component class has. One of them, for example, is render. This function is defined in the React.component class, and it's something that the React framework calls when it's time to actually render your HTML into the virtual DOM. Okay? So you don't actually have this function on your class per se. You're extending it from the base React component class. It's kind of a weird thing to wrap your head around because you're like, oh, these classes, they like take one and build upon each other. But if you remember a little bit about how the prototypes work for the constructors, the prototype is not quite the same, but kind of like that, right? You can define stuff on your prototype, and then your function or your constructor, the object that comes out of it, now has access to those prototype functions. And then you could take something else and extend that prototype. And so then that has access to it. You're not using explicitly the extends keyword in those regards, but it's effectively the same thing. It's called inheritance.
Is this called counter, or is counter something different?
Counter is this whole thing from this curly brace to this curly brace. It is the counter class.
Is something as an extended counter?
No,
Or extended?
the React component. Yes, the React component has a whole bunch of fun stuff on it that you get for free. And now Counter has it. That was a great question. So, any other questions on this before we move on?
React will overwrite functions if they already, like if you define them in your class, but they were already defined in the React component class.
Will React overwrite functions if you define them in your class, but they're already defined in the React component? So React doesn't have anything to do with that. What it is your class, when it extends the component, there are certain functions React gives you. Will component mount, or component will mount, component did mount, component will unmount, should component mount, or should component render, or something like that, right? And then render. And those are all functions that exist on the React component in one way or another. And when you add them to your class, you're overriding the one that the React component comes with. So every React component has this like component did mount that fires as soon as the render is done for the first time, right? And it does nothing effectively. But if you add it to your class, so say we added it to our counter here, I broke things. That's okay. So now that I've added it here, every time this render triggers and the component did mount fires, it's going to do whatever I tell it to do now. So I'm overriding what React is giving me, not the other way around.
Yeah, that's what I was asking. If it was valid to do that.
Yep, it is valid to do that, and that's what those special React functions do. And if you go through the React documentation, they give you a list of these functions. There's like 6 or 7 of these lifecycle functions is what they're called, right? That have to do with the lifecycle of the React component. And you specifically want to update some of those. Like you want to override some of them. Component did mount sometimes is great for loading data after the component renders, right? So say you have a component that's going to show loading spitter or loading text while something's being fetched from an API, you would do it in the component did mount. And when the component did mount was done, you could do this.set state loading is false or whatever, and then tell the loading spinner to go away. So that's effectively how React interrupts with your custom code, is you extend it, React, and does whatever it needs to do with it. Make sense? What library do we use to handle routing with React? Anyone? React Router. That's it. So React Router does a bunch of fun stuff. So you can see there's this weird router component right here that has a bunch of junk in it. It has some links, has some routes, and then it has these base components that we're rendering inside of the routes. So like home, about, and you can click here and see how they change with the React Router. So the funny thing about single page applications is they're a single page, right? So you can't really do any routing that doesn't exist. There's not any URLs. It's one URL. This is the page that you're at. So routers like React Router are used to circumvent that limitation where we can't have routing anymore. Say you have an e-commerce website, right? And you have a product page. You have myecommerce.com/product/50 fish or whatever, or /10 because it's the ID. And you want people to be able to bookmark that and easily discover that. Maybe you want some search engine optimization, right? Some SEO. You need a way to expose that URL to the outside world, and these routers are kind of how you start to facilitate that. Without them, you're just got a single page. Whenever people visit it, they just get whatever's at that page. So that's what React Router is helping do, and it does that through some interesting mechanisms with these route components and this router component. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more today. So if you have questions on this, feel free to ask now, but we're also going to cover it a little later. So any questions on any of this stuff? Ooh. What else do I need to learn about React? A lot? Not much, really. So this is a funny aside. Last time I taught this class for the cohort I was in, I was the first one I did, right? And when we got to this one, I kind of see this slide is a little bit demeaning, realistically. They say not much really, which is true. It's supposed to be motivational, okay? Let's be honest. They're supposed to be like, not much. You learned everything you need to know. You just have to, let it sink in and practice more and blah, blah, blah. And that's true. It is true that what you've learned about React so far is pretty much everything you're effectively going to be doing with React. The thing that's not necessarily true about it is you're still learning, right? You don't know all of it just because you've seen it once. So the distinction there is kind of subtle, but I don't really see it. You guys don't have a lot left to learn. You do have a lot left to learn and a lot left to study, but you've seen everything you're going to do. So you at least have exposure to it. What else do you need to be exposed to with React? Well, technically nothing if you wanted to build a React app, right? Technically nothing. Now the ecosystem is vast. There's a lot much more out there, but take it how you will. Don't feel discouraged though by them saying this. That's basically what I'm trying to get at. I don't want anyone to feel discouraged that they should be a React master, because you won't be. I've been doing React for like a year and a half now, and I'm still learning random things every day. I'm like, oh, I did not know you could do that, and you just figure it out. So you'll learn stuff about React forever, effectively, while you're using it. You'll constantly be learning, but you've seen and been exposed to the vast majority of what React has. You got this. Trilogy says you got this. I say you got this. You'll get it. So what is next? Today, we're going to start talking about your full stack. Okay, so how do we take React and build a real full stack application with it? This magical React that acts nothing like any other sort of library we've used so far. Before we get started, are there any questions? Nope. Done? Cool. All right. Let me go ahead and pull up my code. Close that. All right. So this application, and I'll blow this up. This application is like our first experience into a full stack app with React. All right. I don't think you guys did any in the last couple lessons, right? You didn't do anything with like Express and React? No. Okay. So this is our first adventure into a full stack app. And it's a full stack app. So I was already making sure I had this set up, and I actually did my NPM installs and stuff. So from here, you can do yarn. You can do yarn install if you want. You can see from the commands in the scripts, there's this install, which is funny because it does a CD to the client and then does yarn install. That's pretty tricky. And you'll notice over here, we have our typical node modules, right? Nothing fancy about that. But we also have a client which has node modules in it. That's interesting. So from the Express sessions that you've already had, I believe that there are some that have like handlebars in it, right? But the handlebar stuff is directly embedded in the Express. So you really only have one project. You may have like a views folder or whatever that has some views in it that you're going to render out those templates. But you don't necessarily have a second application inside your first application, right? So it's a little curious. Does anyone have a guess as to why that is? To keep it modular, yeah. Yeah, definitely. To keep it modular, that's a great answer. When you have a client and a server that aren't necessarily the same code, because they're not, they're actually two totally different applications. And there's 1.5 million ways that you could build this kind of architecture, and this is one of them. They're separate applications. They don't share the same code. A lot of times what you'll see in a real production environment is you'd have a README up here, and then you'd have two folders, server and one that says client, right? And in the server one, you'll have the server stuff, and in the client one, you'll have the client stuff. It's just another way you could parse it. But basically the idea is we have two separate apps now. The reason why they're still together is because they're related. They're very highly related. Even though they're separate apps and they could technically function separate from each other, they really need each other to do anything of consequence. So having them bundled like this is a good organizational mechanism. And you'll notice up here we don't have a whole lot, right? We have a yarn lock and a package lock because I ran npm install on accident. And then we have a server.js. Server.js probably looks pretty familiar, right? Forgive my console, it does whatever it wants. Probably looks pretty familiar. At this point, this is a really pretty simple, comparatively, Express app, and we've worked with these a few times, but we've never deployed any React with it. It's always been Vue templates or something, and they're all kind of bundled together. So again, that's what's a little different about it. So we got our body parser, our Express. You know, we got the whole port syntax, right? Give us a default port. We're defaulted to 3001. We're going to go ahead and instantiate Express, add our basic middlewares. No problem there. We got our basic middlewares. If we're in production mode, we're going to go ahead and add a static middleware, or basically a static file that Express can serve to client/build. Now, anyone want to guess what is in client/build? The client's code? Yep, the client's compiled code, right? So in the Create React app, if you do like yarn build, it builds a minified production grade deployment of the React code. So, you know, it takes out all the extra crap, it gets rid of extra space, it makes it real nice and tiny, and makes it so you can serve it up super fast on the internet. So if we're in production mode here, which you can pretty easily specify through the command line, we're going to just serve those production level resources. However, if we're in dev mode, which we're in, we're just going to do an app.get, an app.get a star. What does the star mean for the route? It means anything, right? Whatever we get, that's the route. And we're just going to send out the HTML file that's in our client build. Just the HTML. That's all we need, right? It's a single one page, one HTML page. There's just the index HTML always that ours on. And then we'll just listen on our port 3001. Nothing too fancy there. Are there any questions on this little Express server? Cool. So let's dive into our client. So here in our client, we have a few things going on. This probably looks relatively familiar to you all now. You know, it's your basic Create React app at this point. There's nothing too fancy in it. It's literally the basic Create React app. You can make this yourself by just making a new repo, create whatever inside of that repo, and it would generate all this fun stuff for you, and then, you know, add a server and do all that stuff at the top level. So this is just the basic stuff. There's nothing too fancy about it. But there are a couple of things here in this package JSON. Well, one in particular, and that's this proxy. Does anyone know what a proxy is on the internet? So proxy is a fancy term basically for a server that sits in front of your server, right? So if you think about the term proxy, like say I'm a proxy for someone in a meeting, I basically just filter information from myself to that person. You can't be there, you need a proxy. So what is a proxy on the internet? Effectively the same thing, but for your web traffic. You have this so-called server that sits in front of your server where when your proxy gets information, it just redirects it to where it actually needs to go. And in this case, the proxy is localhost 3001. Does anyone recognize that port? What port is that? That's our Express app port, right? So we're proxying this information that we're getting from our React Create app from port 3000, which is the default that it'll normally start on, to port 3001, which means we can hit port 3001 and go ahead and get our React app. So that's like the key thing here is we have this Create React app, but they added this cool proxy in a package JSON, which isn't a normal thing in the package JSON. Create React app has special code to handle that. So if we look in the main package JSON again from the top, you can see if end node in the start equals production, then we're going to run start prod. Otherwise, we're going to do start dev. And if we look at start prod, it just goes ahead and runs the server. We do start dev, and it runs them on the server, right? So it runs like two things at once, which is pretty crazy. So if we just go ahead and go here, and we'll do yarn start. Do yarn start. And it's opening on my other screen, of course. So it started the Create React app. Oh, no, it didn't like that. It didn't like my proxy for whatever reason. But either way, it started the Create React app, right? And it's proxying out to 3001. So you can go ahead and test stuff and like make calls to your API through port 3001. All right, does anyone have any questions on what we've just seen? Nope.
So with the proxy, is it node that's the proxy that's in the middle and like sending the traffic to the React app through 3001, or is it the React app sending it to node?
The Create React app is hosted through, it's probably hosted through like Webpack or something. So it's some other like server, a little process that's sitting in between the two that's actually hosting that. It's facilitating that proxy. So there's some code somewhere deep in Create React app that knows how to handle this proxy variable inside your package JSON. So it could be a node process if they wrote it that way. I've not looked at the code that handles the proxy, so I can't actually tell you. But it's something that does that. Ooh. So we're going to go ahead and get started on our first lesson for today. If no one has any more questions on that. Let me just find it. So we're going to do it's called React Recipes. So it's number 8 for the TAs. If you guys want to slack out the unsolved version. And we're going to spend some time doing that. Do Yarn, the React ecosystem is generally based around Yarn, so I would always use Yarn from now on. So again, the proxy, just to reiterate on it, if we wanted to take our Create React app and make requests to our API, we need this proxy. Otherwise, we're only going to be allowed to make requests to our server, which is 3000, which is the Create React X server, which only hosts React. It doesn't actually do anything of substance is for us. So in this instance, to let us do more, which is talk to our Express server. You guys know if Jason's coming in today? Can't even come in here. What? God, yeah. I know he won't come yet. Not today.
Maybe we'll get Tuesday and we'll bring you a customer to celebrate.
For a while. He might ask me to teach you how to sing, but you're free in a row, and you're not doing it regularly. I mean, it's cool anyway. But
Yeah.
Are we still booting up our server with the old server? We have to run more or something.
Well,
I'm saying it's spun up my server on 2001, 2000, or 2004.
well, Yarn, your package set based on it would define like Yarn start if you have Express installed or boot up your server, right? You don't have to, you don't have to type in the server in a separate terminal.
if the script has a script for Node server or whatever, then you use that script. So the yarn whatever. If that doesn't exist, then you have to do it Node server yourself. So I'm not sure if the activity just gives you that for free or if you guys have to add it. I haven't looked at the unsolved folder. Yeah, there's a yarn install, and then you should be able to run yarn start, so they say, to get something to start. So it'll boot to 3000, but what the proxy allows you to do is make API requests to 3001. Or you can make API requests to 3000, right? And say you have like /API/burgers. I think it'll go through and it'll proxy it to 3001, and then the API will get it.
I can set it as a different name. Probably that and it can go anywhere to actually support.
Yeah. To whatever's running on 3001.
Run start. That doesn't actually run your
npm start if the script is built to run the front end.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the package based on it. We always use code. That's what certain servers never like when it's dev and stuff.
Yeah, so the dev work it's running, the start dev runs both. It's running the client and it's running the server. And see the I think that once the client starts the client starts. So it runs both. Fraud, it runs the server and it hosts the files.
Oh, yeah. Does the proxy automatically kind of know that, like, well, the proxy's in the front end, but like, does node, or does the package trace on the server end know the look for that front end? Look for that proxy?
Say that again?
Like when you start this application, you're starting the server side with the basically node server JS that node start production does.
Yeah.
Does it know that like is it defined in that package trace on node there's some command?
Go ahead and do start prod. So if you come
Their
here,
prod is just node server JS on it.
right. So if you do start prod like so, then you go to, let's open up,
So it says it's on the
if you go to localhost 3001, didn't fire it up. Aha. So it's, oh, I didn't build. That's why. Yeah, see, no such directory. So if you do yarn, go ahead and do yarn build, and then you can do yarn start prod, and then you can go to 3001 and actually see the hosted files. See down here, I'm no longer getting that error. So if I go to localhost 2001, my little React app is attempting to do something. Yeah. There's just an error in it or something like that. But it's hosted technically. That's nice. But when you do the yarn start dev, actually is hosting what's it called, the client on 3000, but the proxy allows you to ping like different routes, basically. So I can actually cancel this. Say I do app. Or I could just do the dot send, right? So you have app get ping, and then everything else is going to be there. If we go into our client, go to source, let's go to client, let's do yarn, add Axios. Then we go in this app, import Axios from did mount X and volt. So if you all want to see an example of the proxy, because I know I talked about it, but I didn't really do an example. Now you're working, but I won't take this from your time. You can see I set up a new route, app.get/ping, okay? And all ping does is send back the word ping. That's all I added to the server. In my app, I installed the Axios package, so yarn add Axios. And in my component did mount, I did a .get to /ping. Now remember, in the dev version of this app, it's hosted at localhost 3000. Okay, and my server is on localhost 3001. So technically, if I just do /ping, it's going to go to localhost 3000 /ping, right? Which theoretically should be nothing. But again, I have that proxy. So you go ahead and run all this jazz. You just do yarn start, and it will open up. Where'd it go? Oh, right there. It'll open up this bad boy, and I console log out the response, and you can see the response right here. It's really hard to see. It's tiny. It's ping. That's what the proxy is doing. It's basically saying, I know where localhost 3000, but we can go ahead and send our traffic to 3001 and call it good. So hopefully that's helpful for your time right now.
So it's your state. So the API gets involved in the app, takes the API, the JSON from the API response, and puts it in the recipes, the app recipes, or state recipes. So it updates the empty array that is state recipes with the JSON from the API response. So then you're in the render return, you're going through state.recipes.map or .for each, however you want to do it, and you're returning the recipe item list.
All right, I'll give you like 1 or 2 more minutes, and then we'll go ahead and talk about this. All right, let's go ahead and go over this exercise. Did anyone finish? You did? Nice. Great job. This is a tough one. Cool. Well, let's go ahead and talk about it real quick. So the first things first, I have my recipes folder, right? A yarn. We're doing anything. Bless you. Yarn real quick. It's going ahead and it's going to install stuff for the client too. It ran the yarn install for me. You can see right here, it says CD client and yarn install. So it's taking care of everything, which is kind of nice. You can open up the client and you'll see the yarn lock and the node modules show up. Sweet. Go ahead and yarn start. Brings it up on my other machine. React recipes. Cool. All right. So let's search for a recipe. Search for chicken. To search, a whole bunch of stuff comes up. Go to the recipe. Pretty cool. Takes you directly to the link. So there's a lot that's going on in here. One, we're experimenting with some AJAX calls, right? Because we have to make calls out to the World Wide Web and do something. We're talking to an API. We have a Create React app that's talking with that API. So let's dig into the code a bit. Okay. So the least important part of this exercise is really what's in this server. If you we're looking at it, or if you struggled with it, that's okay. It's not a huge deal, right? If you got to the React, that's kind of the thing we really want to focus on in today's lessons. And we got a lot of. So you notice this is almost exactly the same as that example I was showing you. The big difference is it has this app use and API routes, which are prefixed with /API, right? So if we remember our routing mechanisms from Express, just open this up. It's got Axios and it's got a router. So it creates a new router from Express. When you go to /API/recipes, it's going to go ahead and make a call with Axios out to recipepuppy.com/API and append a query that is our query, which is effectively that search string we typed in. You know, it's a query string at the end of our URL, and it gives us some results. And we go ahead and just res.json those results. So we get a JSON blob back to our React app of everything we got from Axios and from Recipe Puppy. So if we look at the app.js, first the index isn't too special, right? So there's not a lot going on there that's different. But the app.js is where like a lot of the meat of this application is. It's kind of nice. Close that. So there's a few things. We have some special components split out here, which are going to be like Bootstrap-like components, and we'll go into those. And then we have some recipe list, recipe item, and all that fun stuff. But really the bulk of it is we have this app component. It's going to be our recipes, and that's what we're going to be rendering in a list when you make that search call out, right? So I do search for chicken. I get a bunch of chicken. It's going to be stored in this part of state, and then the search is obviously that search that's in the text box. We have a handle input change, like we've seen in some of our examples so far, and it does the dynamic storage and state right here, the dynamic state change. So this is pretty standard too. Form submit is kind of the neat part, right? Because this is where we're actually calling out to our API, and we have this API user that we actually make the recipes call through. And we'll look at that in just a moment. But you can imagine this is just going to be an Axios call or something out to our API, because we have that proxy still in this Create React app, which we can go ahead and look at. See, whoop, proxy. So you needed that. You didn't have it. We're going to go ahead and get back recipes from our API, and we're going to set state the recipes, that array, to the recipes that we get back. And if there's an error, we'll log the error. We're not doing anything about it. We're not really expecting an error, but just in case. So this is really where we get stuff, and this is where you would be clicking on that search button, right? You hit enter on the search button, you click the search button, it's going to do this form submit. And if we go down here, you see we have a button, success, this is search. The on click is registered to that handle form submit, right? recipe search. Has that handle input change? And remember the value, recipe search right here. It's set dynamically. This will be recipe search because the name of the input is, again, recipe search. So there's a lot of repetition here, but it makes it kind of easy to track where things are going, right? You can just search for recipe search, find everywhere the recipe search is referenced, and know exactly how it's working. Search for a recipe. And then right here, we have a cool ternary that helps us render our recipe list because, you know, in the beginning, we're not going to have any. So it's kind of nice for the user experience to say something about that. You haven't searched yet. You don't have any to display. Say we go out and we actually make a call for recipe for something really weird for like sand, right? Sand. There's probably a recipe for sand. Probably, you know, sand chicken or something, and it's made with something that makes it look like sand. I don't know. But just think of something that wouldn't have a recipe. This is what you'd get, and that's kind of nice. It gives the user some feedback of what they may or may not have done wrong. It's a nice thing that single-page applications kind of give you for free, like React. There's not a whole lot of logic you got to put there. Otherwise, we have a recipe list, which has this crazy map function in it. Does anyone remember what the map function does? It's like a for loop, but it does something special.
Each array or each element in the array, and it does whatever you tell it to do.
Goes through each element of the array and does whatever you tell it to, so like can transform it or something. And what's the output of the map? You're on the right track. So the return value of the map is going to be that array, but transformed, right? So you take every element of the array, you transform it somehow, and you're going to get back an array of those transformed elements. So you're going to have the same number of elements, just in their transformed state. In this case, kind of cool. I don't know if anyone's figured this out yet, but you can go ahead and map directly to a React component. So we're actually returning React components. So we're mapping over these crazy recipes that are just some random junk we got from recipepuppy.com, whatever that is, and turning it into actual React components. And the rest of these are pretty much just, you know, special components we made from Bootstrap. Column, right? We all remember the column, rows, and containers from Bootstrap. Basically, they're just wrapped right here in React. If you look at those components, we can go ahead and go to a button. And button is just button, button large, button type. So this is just basically a wrapper around Bootstrap for us, which is kind of nice. But what are the cool components? The recipe list. That's an interesting one. Is it? Not really. It's just a UL with our list group class. Recipe list item. There's a little bit of stuff here. So there's some cool stuff going on. So we have a thumbnail, another component. So you'll notice that with React, there's a ton of components, and there's imports everywhere. That's the case in an app. But it's going to happen. So you kind of got to get used to the fact that things are very componentized, right? The point of React is you get those small components. You can put them in different folders and kind of make it easy to wade through each one individually. This recipe list item looks like there's a lot going on, and there is. But imagine if all this HTML was in one file, it'd be pretty big, right? And it'd be pretty terrifying to go through all that at once. It's kind of the benefit of React. So remember, in our app, we have that cool map right here. Takes in the recipes, passes in information about the recipe to this recipe list item. If we go to the recipe list item, you can see it has being passed in. This is an arrow function. There's no state with the recipe list items. They're just rendered exactly how we tell them to be rendered. And we have the thumbnail. Okay, so you can see thumbnail right there. We have our ingredients. If you go back to this one, the app, you have the ingredients. We have our href, right? Oops, didn't mean to delete that. And again, you can see they're just being passed directly through. Those props, they're like the properties. They're the attributes of the HTML element on the outside. On the inside, they're the properties of the object you're creating. If that helps anyone. But that's kind of what's going on, right? And it's just a list item, list group item. Again, we have a very familiar Bootstrap syntax with the size of the columns. We have this thumbnail component. We can go ahead and look at the thumbnail component, which has its own CSS even. And again, this is real simple, just a div that effectively shows an image with its style. There's some cool syntax here if we're not familiar yet. So one of them is, have you seen the direct import of the CSS in React? Right? It's a cool side effect. I might have talked about it when I was here last. Duran might have talked about it when he was teaching you. But again, we'll reiterate. You can import directly CSS and just get the side effects of those CSS in your React. So we have this thumbnail class name, right? And we don't have like a CSS file that we're importing per se into our HTML. We're not linking to it directly in our HTML. We just have it defined right here in its own CSS file, and our thumbnail component just imports it in, and through magic, you get access to those classes and they actually show up, which is kind of neat. It's side effect imports, right? So again, we're just telling it this div, it's an image. These are basic, for the most part, your like basic HTML stuff, right? Your basic HTML attributes. Nothing too terribly exciting there. However, it's cool that you get this HTML-like syntax in your JavaScript. Still, that's the neat thing about React. The other cool thing is, well, the weird thing, I suppose, is these double curly braces, right? So we talked a little bit about how the curly braces are like your expression evaluation. So whatever you put in there, it basically takes it and takes the value of whatever you put in those curly braces. And it gets kind of confusing when you see an object inside the curly braces because you're like, well, I have curly braces and curly braces again. Kind of reminiscent of handlebars, right? Handlebars has the double curly braces as your template. Maybe reminiscent in look, but it actually is not reminiscent at all in what it really does. So that's kind of unfortunate, but it's still neat, right? It just goes to show that these curly braces you can put whatever you want in them. Again, we go back to our app. Got the cool ternary that renders stuff. Let's go ahead and look at our API in these utils. So it's pretty simple. We're importing Axios like we do in our API. We have this special get recipes function. We just make an Axios call /API/recipes. Again, because we have the proxy, that get isn't going to necessarily resolve to localhost 3000. It does resolve to localhost 3000, but because we have the proxy, it forwards that traffic on to localhost 3001, which is where our server is running, and that's how it gets the /API/recipes call. Before we move on, does anyone want to remind the class of what export default does? Any ideas? Anyone? Exports the, what was that? Exports the whole file, exports everything you got in that default. Yeah. How many export defaults can you have in a file? One. You can have one. And if you see in the app, you know that because like these components, it just directly imports it, and there's not like a name associated with it, right? We're calling it API. That's a good association because the file's called API, but I can call it whatever I want. Call it Jim. It'd still work. You know, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what the name is. Now, another cool way you can see the imports before we leave is like this. So this is literally an index file that just directly exports stuff from other things, right? There's no imports even. It's like an export from an import. And if you look in the app where we have the rec list item, or the recipe list, I mean, in the recipe list item, they're by name because we have two of them here. And you'll notice that the names are just directly correlated with the file names here. Because you're not giving it an explicit name when you do your export, it's just going to take whatever the default file name is. We go to something like the thumbnail. This one's even wackier. Export in brackets default from thumbnail. If we go back to the app, we'll see the thumbnail. Oh, the thumbnail's not in this one. The thumbnail is in the recipe list item. Again, it's the default export, right? So the name associated with it in our the file that's importing it doesn't necessarily matter. Doesn't have to match thumbnail. But because we have this crazy like export and then directly export the default or whatever, it acts as a default export. This is just shorthand syntax for saying like something along the lines of this: import thumbnail from thumbnail, right? And then export default thumbnail. Effectively what that shorthand syntax for. Just take the default directly from this import and export it again. Now you may ask yourself, why is, what's the point of that?
The other one we had export. Is there a reason why you wouldn't do export default something, export default something?
That's a good question. Why don't we just do export default recipe list? Export default recipe list item. You can only have, you have one per file. Exactly. You caught yourself. So there's two things in here we want to export. We can't do export default. And again, this wacky syntax, why are we doing this? Why are we just exporting the default again when this thumbnail file already does an export default? Anyone have an idea?
We don't have to target thumbnail file.
Exactly. You don't have to you don't have to target thumbnail/thumbnail. You can just target the thumbnail folder because it has an index.js, and JavaScript has this magical thing where it just finds the index.js. So any questions on this little exercise we did? It was a tough one. There's a lot going on here. But you got to see a lot of React and how it talked to a server and all that. Cool. Here's another assignment we're going to do. It is assignment number 9, Ajax books. We'll give you about 10 minutes. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time on this one because the next exercise is a little bit more important. This next assignment too uses Mongo, so make sure your Mongo instance is running on your machine. So if you run, there's a seed script you can run. If you run it, you get an error that says use Mongo client is no longer required. Please get rid of it. Open up seeddb.js and there's an object that says use Mongo client true. Just delete that whole object, that whole options object. You don't need it. Then you might get a nice error message that says undefined number of records inserted. It still worked for me. So this example is just bogus, I guess, but still worked. Yeah, in the CDB, do you guys have the CDB script? Go in there and you'll see, here, I'll pull it up. You'll see there's this Mongoose Connect and it has an object underneath the MongoDB URI that has use Mongo client true. Delete it. Yep, so it looks like that. Delete that. Get rid of the extra comma. You don't need any of that. Just make your life miserable. Just make you sad.
Okay, try to run it and stuff that error saying like please don't perform supported.
Yep, that's that weird error. You'll still see undefined number of records inserted. Just ignore that one. Just check your MongoDB and make sure it inserted everything okay. What's up, man?
It's getting this error I've never seen before that's preventing him from running his applications. It puts out a npm run client error spawn exe and then a whole bunch of stuff afterwards.
I'll come look at it in a moment. Oh, I got another one who's got it too.
I had to look on Stack Overflow.
Oh, it was Greg?
It's hard to, yeah, it's just Greg, yeah. It's somebody vaguely had an error like this and said it could be a path issue, but it doesn't seem like it's a problem with Node, because Node's been working fine for him. So,
You just did yarn start?
yeah, and he hasn't had any problems running the past React stuff that was just front end yarn.
Does he have Windows?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's not. I don't really know. So everything that you can fix it.
Real quick, so we can get on to the last exercise, or the last exercise for the break. I took the liberty of doing the install and doing the seed DB, that just be yarn seed or whatever. We'll go ahead and do yarn start. And it's in my Mongo database. Just show real quick. Here's all the stuff. Test. This. Ooh. It's kind of like my test data at work. It's not very good test data, but it works. And did it store it? I don't think it actually did. Interesting. All right. Well, for some reason that failed. I'm not sure why. But anyway, that's the gist of the application. And this is the same application we'll be working with in the next exercise. Okay. Our server is a little bit more in depth this time. I'll expand that out. Now we have our app used on routes, okay, which we had in the last exercise, but we also have the Mongoose Connect. So if we all remember Mongoose, you have to get a MongoDB URI. Now, if you don't have on the default port, which is 27017, you're going to need to specify that. So that one's on you if you did a special installation. Otherwise, it should just work in theory, so they say. We can go ahead and look at our index for our routes. Again, this is just like a basic router to help us aggregate everything in one place. So we have our /API routes and then our hosting route for index HTML. And then our API routes, we have this books. And the book route, all the book route does is calls out to the book controller, which just sets up the basic functions we call from the routes, right? So if we look at the controller, the book controller real quick. So this is a Mongoose model. And it's just the basic db.book.do the Mongoose commands, right? So we're all we remember the Mongo commands, the Mongoose commands. And we just res JSON everything out of there, right? So nothing too new here. We've done the Express servers with the controllers and the models and all that. We look at the model. Our schema is pretty simple. Not a whole lot happening there either. Just a couple required things, and then our synopsis, that optional one, the big string, and then a date. The fun is in the client. So go to our app. So this is a different take on the app, okay? So it's a little bit more terse than some of the other app components we've seen thus far, and that's good. This is the main component. It's like the entry point, effectively. It's not the actual entry point, because remember, that's the index.js, right? Where you do the React DOM.render. But it is the first component, so it's like the container for every other component. And in that regard, you want to keep it really clean and keep the components it renders very focused, right? So we have our nav, which helps us view the books, and then we have the actual books list. So if we just jump to those, oh, books is a page. So if we jump to this page of books, so this is a bigger component, and this has our big list of books. We list items and stuff, and this is like where all the meat of that big list is. And the first thing it's got to do is after it loads, so the component did mount, and then remember what that does? Yep. So the component did mount fires after this first render. Fires one time, because after the first render, the component is so-called mounted. It runs component did mount, and until you unmount that component, it won't run again. And so in this case, it uses our API utils, which again is very similar to how it was in the last example, where it just uses Axios to call out to our local server and gets the books that exist in Mongo. And it'll go ahead and it'll load those into that list, right? And then we have a bunch of those bootstrap components that we've built. What book should I read? What book should I can't read, apparently. We have our little form, which has our title, our author, our synopsis. That form that I filled out to add the test book that didn't really seem to work properly. And we have some other components that we'll look at too in a little bit. And then we just have our nice ternary. If there aren't any books, we're not going to render anything. No results to display. And if there are books, we'll go ahead and render them in a list. Again, we'll map over all the books, and we'll just assign them to a list item component, and they'll have a delete button, and voila. Everything there is fancy and fun. And they even have their own URL, which is kind of cool. So look at the components. We have like our form button. Again, this is just a pass-through for our submit. Okay? We'll go back to the books. The form button. That is not the right one. Well, submit. Actually do anything. Would you look at that? I don't even know where the submit function is. I don't think they have the delete button also does nothing. It just renders the little X. Okay, and it's a span. So for now, nothing is happening on our server to actually get stuff to the server quite yet. But you can see right here, we have the save book function. Our API that Axios uses, not used anywhere yet, right? I just did a quick global search. So there isn't actually a form to submit. So the reason why my form cleared and nothing happened is because this exercise doesn't actually save the books, which is going to happen next. But again, this is just an Axios post. We'll have a delete. There'll be an Axios delete. We've got everything set up to build this full website that's going to delete books, save books, allow you to change books, do whatever you want, right? And this was just the setup for all of that. Go back to our app, nice and clean. Books, this is where the magic happens. It goes ahead and loads the books. Component did mount. Load books, just a nice simple function that calls that API get books. Axios call. We have the proxy. Goes to port 3001, right? Any questions on this? So there's not a whole lot of new stuff that happened in particular example or something. Or would you like, I'll have available. Doctors like to solve a lot of this to kind of start your way on adding and saving books. Now, one of the key things with this next exercise is we want it to be really nice and friendly for the user. So think about that while you're working on it. Okay, so we're going to just really jump into our next exercise. We spend about 15 minutes. We'll take a quick break and then we'll go over it. So realistically, you get more than 15 minutes. Maybe we'll go over it before the break. So then you can just break and not worry about it. You want to select that out, Trent? We are on 10. Yep. Ajax form delete. Next one we're going to do. And again, if there's anything you want me to scroll to in this or any files you want to view, let me know.
No, you're good. You're good.
So this is the problem. File. Yeah.
So you're
Super simple one. When you write the TS, that arrow, parentheses versus brackets, is that a React thing or is that
it's just like data all I know is how like
So I know this is a tough one, but we're only going to use a couple more minutes. Going to go over real quick, and then we'll have a break.
Joseph,
What's that?
after class, can you kind of go over the router thing? The React router?
I will definitely sit with you after class and go over more.
Yeah, that would be good. Because Chris is like, okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
You're the person that
And, you know, I feel more than used to. Because we haven't even talked about it.
oh,
So it's definitely.
there's like two folders.
Yeah.
Yeah, two.
Yeah.
And
Well, activities.
activity.